The cruel Soviet government evicted many of its own people from their homes and robbed them, simply because of their nationality. People were inhumanely and mercilessly deported to other regions, usually remote and with much worse living conditions. It's when you're living your life, working, making plans, saving up, say, for a new washing machine, and only yesterday you painted the bedroom window. And today or tomorrow, a representative of the criminal authorities comes to you and takes everything from you. And under guard, they take you to remote Siberia. And it's not because you did something wrong, but because you were born into a family whose nationality causes horror, fear, or dislike among the aggressors. To be honest, I'm shocked. The deeper you dig, the more upset you get that this keeps happening. Once in the USSR, hundreds of thousands of people, dozens of different ethnic groups, were deported, and it seemed like today this would be impossible, but history is repeating itself again. Russia is forcibly deporting Ukrainians at gunpoint to remote regions. I highly recommend watching the video from beginning to end, because you will see what the USSR actually did. They didn't write about this in Soviet history textbooks, and compare this to current events. My name is Semyon, and the Mega Show TV channel is starting. Начинаем. Who was deported? The Poles. From where? From the territory of Ukraine, which was closer to the Polish border, and from the occupied territories of modern-day Belarus and Ukraine. When? From 1936 to 1941. Where? Kazakhstan, Siberia. How many people? According to different sources, from 450,000 to 1.2 million people. In 1936, the authorities set themselves the goal of deporting the Poles, whose number was estimated. More than 15,000 families were counted, which amounted to about 40 to 65,000 people. These people held views that did not support the authorities. After all, the authorities only exploited them and gave nothing in return. At that time, they lived on the territory of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, which gave them the opportunity to resist the regime and proclaim their own rules. This was disadvantageous for the Stalinist regime. That's why they started looking for new places for them to live. In particular, Poles were deported from the Kamianets-Podilsky, Zhytomyr, Vinnytsia, and Kirovohrad regions to the Karaganda and North Kazakhstan regions. People were simply dragged out of their homes in the middle of the night, sometimes not even allowed to pack their suitcases or gather their belongings. Those who resisted were beaten. Those who resisted strongly were simply shot. And then they were settled in absolutely terrible conditions where there was no medical system at all. That is, there were no hospitals, no kindergartens, no stores. Some of the schools that were meant for those who were deported quickly were disbanded because there were no textbooks or teachers. The houses were cold and damp, and they were wooden barracks. During that period, this played a positive role for the Stalinist regime, because people with low social status were settled in place of the Poles so that they would maintain order with their lack of opposition. The second wave of Polish deportations occurred in 1939-1941, when Stalin, in fact, in cooperation with Hitler, seized part of Poland. On that territory lived people who really did not want Soviet rule. Very interesting things happened next. According to Soviet data, people were allowed to take up to 1 ton of belongings with them, but according to eyewitnesses, they were only allowed to take 1 suitcase. And even then, without any valuables, since they were simply confiscated by the Soviet authorities. And who do you think should be believed? The thieves who took away the homes, or the people from whom they were taken? I think the answer is obvious. People were also promised financial compensation and jobs, but in the end, they didn't get any of that. And instead of the decent housing they had, they were moved into modern barracks. This deportation also led to mass mortality. Just during transportation, about 100 to 120,000 people died. And then people died from unsuitable living conditions and from the harsh climate, which was especially hard for the elderly. They experienced emotional grief and suffering from the eviction. Who was deported? Chechens and Ingush. From where? From the territory of the Chechen Ingush USSR and the adjacent districts. When? From February 23rd to March 9th, 1944. Where to? To Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. How many people? From 500,000 to 650,000 Chechens and Ingush. Sometimes it's hard to understand some actions of the authorities, and even harder to accept them. In my opinion, such deportations of entire peoples are an indelible shame, especially when there really are no reasons for them. Officially, Stalin and his associates, of course, stated the reasons. These were mass collaboration with the Nazi occupiers and a huge surge in banditry. The reasons seem serious, but there are a few points to consider. First of all, the Chechens and Ingush physically could not collaborate with the occupiers because there was no occupation. The Germans managed to capture only a small part of the Malgobek district and were quickly driven out of there. And secondly, the level of banditry did not exceed similar rates in neighboring regions. From the capital of southern Russia, from the city of Grozny, about 650,000 Ingush and Chechens were deported at that time. This was accompanied by terrible events. Unlike the deportation of the Poles, here the authorities acted very quickly and more harshly. At night, soldiers would break into homes and forcibly load people into transport vehicles. Many people escaped directly from the columns that were being led to their destination. There were so many escape attempts that the authorities had to deploy up to 100,000 soldiers. And just imagine, while the war against the Nazis was going on, Stalin decided to use 100,000 people to deport and rob his own people. The most interesting thing is that time goes by, but the methods don't change. These 100,000 soldiers who were involved in the deportation started being brought to this region as early as 1943. And to reassure the local population, it was officially announced that large-scale exercises would be held in the mountainous areas of the Republic to prepare the Red Army's offensive in the Carpathians. I mean, exercises, you know? The local population then housed these soldiers, fed them, and gave them supplies of their own food. And in the end, these soldiers robbed them and evicted them from their own homes. And those who tried to escape and hide in the mountains were shot on the spot in front of women and children. I don't understand, and probably never will, those brainwashed people who justify this and consider Stalin a good leader. Although Stalin is a thing of the past, now there is their own hero on whose orders a new crime against humanity is being committed, but more on that later. As a result, according to official data, 780 people were killed, but unofficially, it's tens of thousands. In some cases, entire villages were wiped out, and the Soviet government only acknowledged this fact as late as 1990. It took almost 50 years for them to have the courage to admit the mass killing of ordinary peaceful people. By the way, the USSR's allies in the war turned a blind eye to all of this and kept silent. They only started talking about it after 1945. Who was deported? The Crimean Tatars. From where? From the territory of Crimea. When? From May 18th to June 14th, 1944. Where to? To Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan. How many people? According to various sources, from 228,000 to 300,000 people. Let's start with who the Crimean Tatars actually are. They are the indigenous people of Crimea. For example, in 1783, they were practically the only people living in Crimea. That's 98% of the population. Then the Russian Empire seized Crimea and began gradually pushing the Crimean Tatars out of their land. By the end of the 19th century, only about 34% of them remained in Crimea. The Soviet Union aimed to complete what the Russian Empire began, drawing on its experience deporting and robbing people. The official reason given was collaborationism, since 3,500 or 3,500 people were accused of cooperating with the Germans. And you see, knowing the Soviet Union, I'm more than sure that there were a huge number of people who were unjustly convicted. As a result, Stalin and Beria decided that the whole ethnic group had to be punished, and the entire population was forcibly evicted from their homes. By the way, if we follow this logic, for the war crimes committed by Russian soldiers in Ukraine, all residents of Moscow, St. Petersburg, and other Russian cities should be deported to Siberia, and other peoples of the Russian Federation should be settled there instead. What do you think? Would that be the right decision? Please write in the comments. Everything basically happened following the Chechen Ingush pattern. 32,000 soldiers at gunpoint burst into homes and gave people from a few minutes to half an hour to pack. People were loaded into trucks and sent to railway stations. Those who resisted were shot on the spot. Just think about it. People had just survived the German occupation. They were hoping for peace. But then the Soviet authorities came. Soviet soldiers, under the leadership of Stalin, were evicting them from their homes, and some were simply killed. Again, what's most interesting is the difference in the data on the number of people who died. During the deportation, according to Soviet data, 191 people died. But according to modern research, more than 8,000. Crimean Tatar sources, according to eyewitnesses, say that the deaths were caused by limited access to water, food, and medicine. That people simply died of hunger right in the train cars, and the soldiers threw them out like useless trash. And Russian sources, in essence, justify these crimes. They say that this death rate is comparable to the natural mortality for such a number of transported people. About 230,000 people, taking into account the travel time. And since there were elderly people among those in the trains, most of the deceased could have died of old age, not from poor conditions. This is just insane, such cynicism. By the way, since 2010 in Russia, the term deportation is no longer used for all these atrocities, and instead the term forced resettlement is used. Well, yeah, they also don't have the courage to call a war. Deportation of the Cossacks. Who was deported? The Cossacks. From where? From the Terek region and Semirechi. When? From 1918 to 1920. Where to? The North Caucasus and the far north. How many people? From 25 to 35,000 people. Modern researchers believe that the deportation of the Terek Cossacks from 1918 to 1920 was the first in the history of Soviet Russia. Let me remind you that deportation is expulsion or exile as a measure of criminal or administrative punishment. Although in essence it is actually just ordinary theft of property by the authorities. And what do you think is the real reason why the Terek Cossacks were simply forcibly driven from their lands? It's simple. It's a matter of money and land ownership. The Terek Cossacks made up only 20% of the region's population, but they owned 30% of all the land and 50% of the land where food was grown. The new authorities, of course, didn't like this, and they wanted to get more money for themselves. Therefore, at one of the government meetings, a decision was made to forcibly deport the Cossacks from their territory. And although, according to the Congress's decision, the resettlement was supposed to be under conditions similar to the previous ones, and the Cossacks were supposed to receive loans to settle in the new place, in reality, everything was done differently. Already at the beginning of the eviction from the stanitsa, 68 people were killed. Of them, 57 were men and 11 were women. The stanitsas were burned, all livestock taken, and the Cossacks had to move between neighboring stanitsas. Researchers disagree on the exact places where the Cossacks were deported, but it is generally believed that it was the far north and the North Caucasus. Thus, it should be noted that there were two waves of Cossack deportations. The first was in 1918, and the second occurred again in 1920. There is the least amount of data about this deportation, because unlike the subsequent deportations, where at least some documentation was kept, and at least some conditions were created just for show, here people were simply driven out of their homes and their land. They were told to go wherever they could. In the end, in April 1921, the Central Executive Committee banned further resettlement of the Cossacks. By that time, 8 stanitsas had been resettled, and 3 more had been looted. Deportation of Koreans. Who was deported? Koreans. From where? From the border regions of the Far East. When? 1937. Where to? To the uninhabited regions of Central Asia. How many people? 173,000 people. According to the Soviet government, the motivation for the deportation of Koreans was the invasion of China by the Japanese Empire on July 7, 1937, since Korea was part of the Japanese Empire. And although the Koreans themselves were not accused of collaborating with the Japanese, this did not stop the Soviet authorities from starting the forced relocation of Koreans. Before the Soviet authorities made the criminal decision to expel Koreans from their homes, there was a massive wave of repression. Its scale was huge even in those incredibly difficult times. During the repression, almost all people with higher education were arrested, and local party leaders of Korean origin were simply eliminated on the spot. They practically wiped out all Korean Red commanders and the entire Korean section of the Comintern. Also, before the final decision on deportation was made, all Koreans were subjected to a so-called purge, just like now, with filtration camps in Mariupol. It's unbelievable, but those distant events are repeating even now. On August 21, 1937, an official decree was issued on the deportation of Koreans from the lands of the Far East. And even though the documents mentioned normal conditions for resettlement, in reality, the residents were given a minimal amount of time to gather their belongings. And then they were loaded into trains for transportation. Such transports were freight cars with two-tier bunks and a stove. One such car could hold up to 30 people, and the train would travel for 30 to 40 days before boarding. People's passports were taken away. Several hundred people died during such transportation. As a result of the deportation of such a significant part of the region's population, settlements founded and fully inhabited by Koreans, Tidzinke, Verkhnaya Ryazanova, Nizhnaya Ryazanova, Ryazanovka, and others, disappeared from the map of Primorsky Oblast. And the population of the collective farms decreased significantly. In turn, the Koreans themselves, who were deported, had their rights severely restricted. They were given the status of administratively exiled and were forbidden to leave Central Asia. But what were the living conditions of the Koreans like? The first 2 years, the so-called adaptation period, were the hardest. During this time, several thousand people died. This was because they had to live in temporary dugouts. After some time, the settlers were given compensation for lost property, and in some places, an allowance of 3,000 rubles per household was provided. Koreans were also allowed to receive higher education and hold good positions. They could work on their own collective farms or join other collective farms. At the same time, since Koreans were scattered across different regions and were being made to adopt Russian culture and language, the authorities managed to achieve that within a generation, sometimes two. The people became Russian-speaking and, as a result, lost their own culture and language. It took Koreans almost 20 years to go through the rehabilitation period after the forced deportation. It was during the period from 1953 to 1957 that the restrictions on the rights of Koreans were lifted. Deportation of the Karachays. Who was deported? The Karachays. From where? From the territory of the Karachay Autonomous Region. When? 1943. Where to? To Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. How many people? 68,614. The fabricated reason for the deportation of the Karachays was the accusation of collaborationism and banditry. And that was despite the fact that most of the male population was serving in the Red Army at the time. So, while the men were fighting, it was decided to evict their families from their homes. Very noble. Before deportation began, the Karachay people faced repressions from Soviet authorities, even though half the population were teenagers and children. Just like today, Russia and its soldiers are only brave against unarmed and peaceful people. At first, the Soviet Union wanted to deport only a part of the people, and on April 15, 1943, a directive was issued to deport 573 people. These were families who were against Soviet power. But since some of them surrendered to the Soviets themselves, 472 people were deported. But in the decree of October 14, 1943, it already applied to all the Karachay people. All of them were to be resettled in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. The deportation process began on November 2 and lasted until the 5th. So, at 2 a.m. on November 2, the blocking of Kirovka's exit routes began, the cordoning off of owls, and the setting up of ambushes, and already from 4 a.m. arrests began. Citizens were given up to 6 hours to gather their belongings and leave the settlement. A total of 34 trains were sent, each carrying 2,000, 2,100 or 2,200 people. Each train had about 50 to 58 cars. What do you think the Soviet authorities did with the property and livestock left by the Karachay people? Naturally, they took it for themselves. For example, on December 10, 1943, to cover state supply obligations, 156,239 head of cattle and horses were appropriated. In addition to that, they also took over outbuildings, equipment, poultry, bees, and vegetables. But let's get back to the Karachay people themselves. The trains transported the residents of the Karachay Autonomous Region to different areas of Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. People were resettled by crowding local collective farmers, workers, and state farm employees. Some people had to live in places that were unfit for habitation, namely club buildings, barracks, dugouts, and half-ruined houses. And even though the NKVD of the USSR tried to take measures to improve living conditions for the deported, in practice, nothing changed. The conditions remained harsh. All able-bodied people were required to work in socially useful jobs. For this, they were placed in agriculture, industrial enterprises, construction sites, and cooperative organizations. The Karachay people were restricted in their rights. They were not allowed to study without permission, otherwise such actions were considered an escape and were subject to criminal liability. During the deportation, more than 43,000 people died from hunger and restrictions. 54% of all those who died were children. It was only in 1980 that a draft was introduced condemning the forced deportation of previous years. And in 1991, a resolution was issued by the Cabinet of Ministers of the USSR, which stated the cancellation of the previously adopted resolution under which the deportation of residents of the Karachay Autonomous Region was carried out. Who was deported? Parts of the civilian population of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. From where? From the annexed territories of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. When? From June 1941 to March 1949. Where to? Siberia and remote regions. How many people? In 1941 in Estonia, there were 10,000 people in Latvia, 15,500 in Lithuania, 34,000. In 1949 in Estonia, more than 22,500 people in Latvia, 43,000 in Lithuania, about 30,000 people. As a result of the violent double annexation of the Baltic republics by the Soviet Union, many people were executed, sent to prisons or to gulag camps. But most of the victims were people who were deported from their homeland to the very harsh and remote territories of Russia. These deportations in the Baltics happened constantly. It was a way of getting rid of a certain nation. But the two largest waves happened in 1941 and in 1949, known as the June and March deportations. As part of the secret protocol to the agreement between Hitler and Stalin, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of 1939, the USSR wanted to establish control over the Baltic countries, which were independent at that time. After the start of World War II and the German-Soviet occupation of Poland in September 1939, the Soviet Union forced Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia to sign a mutual assistance treaty, which allowed the USSR to station a large number of its troops in the Baltics. After the end of the war with Finland in the spring of 1940, the Soviet Union focused all its efforts on occupying the Baltics. And in the summer of 1940, all three republics were occupied. They staged elections for leadership that suited the Soviets, just like the so-called Little Green Men in Crimea. And already in August 1940, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia were annexed to the Soviet Union against the will of the majority of their residents. Does that remind you of anything? Seize by force, hold a referendum, announce annexation and the creation of a controlled territory, Crimea, LPR, DPR, and, God forbid, HRNR. From the very first year of Soviet rule, economic repression began, along with the elimination of any non-communist activity, rising prices, and shortages of consumer goods. There was a significant deterioration in the economic situation. Discontent among the people was growing. Protests occurred, but the Soviet authorities ruthlessly suppressed them. Everyone who was against Soviet rule was subjected to repression, and unfortunately, even deportation was not the worst, because many people were simply killed. And you know, brainwashed Russians very often like to say, why don't you show how the Native Americans were destroyed in America? Or how Great Britain wiped out the indigenous population of Australia? And you know what's most interesting? We've already filmed that. But there's a big difference in these brutal chapters of history. The people who, for example, conquered America, where Native Americans once lived, have long since died. Because that was a very, very long time ago. It was back in those days when the rights of ordinary people were violated. If you just Google deportation of peoples, you'll see how many criminal acts like that were committed against various nations. This includes the expulsion of Jews from Australia in the 15th century, the Trail of Tears in the USA in 1831, and the deportation of the French from Canada in the 18th century. But only Russia carried out such forced deportations of peoples in the 20th century. All other countries had long since become civilized. And the scariest thing is that even in the 21st century, when it seems like such events shouldn't happen anymore, Russia is once again committing criminal acts in Ukraine, seizing land, looting territories, and deporting civilians to other places. But let's go back to 1941. It all started on the night between June 13th and 14th, 1941. If you pay attention to the date, it's right before Hitler attacked the USSR. The NKVD carried out the deportations with particular cruelty. Notice that, as always, the USSR acted especially treacherously in such matters. At night, when people were sleeping, criminals broke into their homes. People were taken away with their entire families, without being allowed to gather their necessary belongings. Men over the age of 16, and there were more than 8,000 of them, were separated from their families and sent to camps, and some were executed. Women, children, the elderly, and the sick were transported in cattle cars, mostly to settlements in Krasnoyarsk Krai and Tomsk Oblast. The conditions were inhumane. The trains traveled for several weeks. Many children and elderly people died along the way. Many who survived the journey did not make it through their first Siberian winter. In total, about 6,000 people died. The operation was directed against the elite, the political and military leadership, and the intelligentsia and business people. The June deportations affected almost all segments of the population, from bourgeois class enemies and members of the intelligentsia to the working class. These people were usually connected with the elites of their independent states, and their nationality did not matter. Among the deported were Estonians, Russians, Jews, and others. The main thing is that they were against the Soviets and fought for their freedom. Then, one dictator was replaced by another. The Baltic countries were occupied by Hitler, and after some time, they were occupied again by the USSR. And now I can already picture brainwashed people writing comments saying that the USSR liberated the Baltics from the fascists. No, no, and again, no. What does liberation mean? It's when a person is in chains and someone comes and frees him, removes the chains, giving him freedom. In the case of the USSR, they just came and took control of the chains for themselves. Well, or maybe I and many others are really misunderstanding the meaning of the word liberation. And in the Russian world, it means to liberate someone from their life, property, money, and freedom. And after World War II, the deportation continued. At the beginning of 1949, Stalin, who was dissatisfied with the slow pace of collectivization in the Baltics, decided on another mass deportation. The operation, called Preboy, had three goals: to speed up collectivization by intimidating the rural population, to cleanse the region of so-called collaborators, kulaks, and nationalists, and to reduce resistance through deportation. Sympathizers, which included the families of opponents of Soviet power, that is, women, children, and the elderly. Note the cynicism in the document meant to regulate transporting people. Document 4.28, Instruction from USSR Ministry of Internal Affairs Convoy Troops, Chief Bachkov, Special Settlements Department, Chief Xian, and the Chief of Train and Convoy for escorting settlers. Formally, it was supposed to regulate the provision of each carriage with the necessary equipment, from toilets to sleeping places and buckets for preparing hot food. Provision of centralized meals for settlers in railway buffets at the stations where the train passes at the rate of 5 rubles per person. Organization of a medical rail car for sick settlers and organization of freight cars for transporting the large belongings of the deportees. In fact, everything was the same as with other deportations. They were not allowed to take anything with them, and they were loaded into cars that were not even suitable for transporting livestock. Not to mention that people were beaten, starved, and those deemed undesirable were shot. I want to pause here for a moment and explain in more detail why such documents were written back then. After all, you might ask, why do this if they acted differently? That's the point. This is a vivid example of how Russia manipulates facts and tries to rewrite history. They evicted a lot of people, taking away their property, but on paper they presented it as just a relocation to another place under super comfortable conditions. However, eyewitnesses never saw these comfortable conditions, because they simply didn't exist. But now any propagandist can say, well, there's a document, it's official. They were relocated in comfortable conditions, everything's fine. That's what's happening now too. For the same reason, Russia is even afraid to call the war a war, coming up with the ridiculous name Special Operation, while acting exactly the same way as Hitler's army did in the 1940s. In total, more than 95,000 people were sent to Siberia in 1949, with the mortality rate among the deported estimated at 15%, which the Soviet authorities considered acceptable losses. Oh, those are just unimaginable numbers. Most of those who were forcibly removed from their homes were never able to return to their homeland. Who was deported? Residents of the Moldavian SSR from Bessarabia and northern Bukovina, which were part of Romania and annexed to the USSR in 1940. When? June 1941, 1944, 1944, July 1944, 1944, March, April 1951. South Kazakhstan, Jambil, and Akhtubinsk regions of the Kazakh SSR, as well as Altai Krai, Kurgan, Tyumen, and Tomsk regions of the RSFSR. According to historians, the number of people is estimated to be in the tens of thousands. The events related to the deportations of the 1940s were long hushed up by both Soviet and Moldovan historiography. Since the late 1980s, a number of decrees have been issued to declassify from archival documents containing information about the repressions, which in turn gave impetus to a thorough study of the facts of lawlessness committed by the Soviet authorities in the Moldavian region. The Moldavian SSR underwent 4 waves of population deportations. The first wave of mass deportations began in 1940-41, that is, before the start of the war between the USSR and Germany. The second wave of deportations was carried out by the communists in 1944, immediately after the liberation of Moldova from the occupiers. This was followed by deportations in 1949 and 1951. Just like in other regions, preparations for deportation began long in advance. Lists were compiled, armed units were brought in, and again, the deportation always began. At night, the village was instantly surrounded by troops, and the chairman of the collective farms, together with officers, would start walking through the streets holding a list of people. Most of all, I want to talk about the July deportation of 1949 because it was the most brutal and large-scale. The mass deportation was preceded by the famine of 1946-47 and forced collectivization. Just imagine what those people had to go through. The peasants had no agricultural machinery or draft animals because the Germans took the equipment first, and whatever was left was taken by the Soviets. There was also no seed fund, so the volume of agricultural production in 1944-1945 was very small. The winter of 1945-1946 turned out to be low on snow, and there was little rain in the spring and summer. The terrible drought dashed the last hopes for a harvest. And the government demanded that the peasants, left alone with the hardened earth, pay all sorts of taxes in kind, such as grain procurements and deliveries to the Red Army Fund. Hunger began due to prolonged malnutrition, epidemics of typhus and malaria, and mortality in the Republic reached alarming levels. According to historians, this was between 100,000 and 300,000 people. There was no way to cope with the famine on their own, and fear of the master, the Kremlin dictator, prevented them from asking Moscow for help. Only on December 21, 1946 did they appeal to Stalin from Chisinau for help. The Republic received 24,000 tons of grain, 500 food distribution points were organized, and in one shift they could feed 100,000 starving people, but even that was far from enough. In February 1947, the population of Soviet Moldova was on the brink of death, and 366,000 poods of flour were urgently delivered to Moldova. The network of food distribution points at medical institutions was expanded, and additional financial resources were allocated to the Republic for the treatment of patients suffering from severe malnutrition, fuel, fodder, seeds. By the spring of 1947, the number of patients suffering from severe malnutrition began to decrease, but the famine did not subside until the end of summer, when the grain crops began to ripen. When I talk about assistance, it's important to understand the full scale and how the authorities have always acted in the Russian Empire, the USSR, and now in Russia. For example, a Moldovan family had 10 sacks of grain. The authorities came and took all the grain, all 10 sacks, leaving them with nothing to eat. After some time, they were given back only 1 sack. That's the assistance they offer, so people don't die from their voluntary surrender of their grain. Do you understand? Recently, Russia did the same thing in Mariupol, destroyed the whole city, killed a lot of people, basically took all the property from the people, and then brought in trucks with aid stolen from Ukraine. And they show it on TV like, see how good we are, but that's me getting off topic. Let's go back to the 1940s, because then a new disaster struck people. The peasantry of the Republic still hadn't recovered from the famine of 1946-47, when they were forced to join collective farms. Forced, exactly. Repressions began against the most stubborn kulaks. The operation, which later became known as South, actually began with a memorandum from the Minister of Internal Affairs of the Moldavian SSR, Fyodor Tutushkin, to Soviet Interior Minister Sergei Kruglov. In his letter dated October 12, 1948, Tutushkin pointed out the remnants of Romanian Moldovan, bourgeois nationalist, kulak bandit, and speculative elements. They resist the modernization of agriculture. You see how beautifully it can be described when people resist being robbed. And here a solution was found very quickly, since there was plenty of such experience in the USSR. The deportation from the territory of the Moldavian SSR of 15,000 kulak families, or at least the most hostile and economically powerful part of the kulaks, up to 5,000 people. On March 17, 1949, the Secretary of the Central Committee of Moldova, Koval, and the Chairman of the Council of Ministers of the Moldavian SSR, Rud, appealed to the Chairman of the Council of Ministers of the USSR, Stalin, with a request for permission to deport the kulaks and former landowners from Moldova. Large traders numbering 10.7 thousand people and together with their families, more than 39,000, and on April 6, 1949, the Council of Ministers of the USSR adopted the corresponding resolution, bringing the total number of people planned for deportation together with their families to 40,850. They were supposed to be deported outside the Moldavian SSR to Kazakhstan, Altai Krai, Kurgan, Tyumen, and Tomsk regions of the RSFSR to places with unbearable natural conditions where labor was needed. Each district was assigned its own deportation quota, and the nominal lists were compiled by the heads of local village councils and party organizations. These lists included merchants, former white guards, people who had cooperated with the Romanian administration, and priests who had miraculously survived previous purges. The main criteria for deportation, however, were the number of hectares of land, livestock, and poultry. Since 1944, well-off peasants had to pay higher taxes on their farms, and as a result, they were automatically put on the blacklists. Those who tried to avoid this fate were sometimes reported by fellow villagers, and sometimes some bad people would simply take revenge on their neighbors and write false denunciations. Preparations for the operation were mostly done by late June. On June 28, 1949, the government of the Republic adopted a decree on the deportation from the Moldavian SSR of families of kulaks, former landowners, and large merchants. Operation South began, as was usual for all such crimes, at 2 a.m. on July 6 and ended at 8 p.m. on July 7, 1949. Those who were deported were allowed to take with them their valuables, money, clothing, footwear, household items, small tools, and a supply of food with a total weight of up to 1.5 tons per family. But in reality, most people barely had time to take only the essentials or whatever they could carry. Notice that regarding belongings, according to documents from different deportations, at first they were allowed to take half a ton of belongings, then a ton, and according to documents from 1949, already 1.5 tons. Just so you understand, 1.5 tons, that would be enough to move all your belongings. But in reality, people were sometimes only allowed to take a single suitcase for the whole family. And according to the testimony of all witnesses without exception, many were sent to Siberia without warm clothing or tools for work. The soldiers simply didn't give them time to pack properly. But then, why do the documents mention 1.5 tons of property? Because the Soviets already knew how to rewrite history back then. After all, recently, when we released a video on our channel about another deported people, we received a comment saying, "You're lying about everything." They wanted to relocate on their own, and they were even allowed to take all their belongings, and a lot of funds were specifically allocated for it. Everything was official and documented. Yeah, sure, tens of thousands of people just woke up in the middle of the night and decided they wanted to give all their property to the authorities and move to Siberia. There are simply no words for such cynicism. The remaining property was confiscated and handed over to the state and collective farms, whatever the state didn't take. And officials often stole it too, as did neighbors who were lucky enough to stay home because they weren't on the lists. Forced eviction, despite the lack of mass resistance, was not without casualties. The Minister of State Security of the MSSR, Mordovets, reported, "Overall, the eviction operation in the Moldavian SSR went quite smoothly, without any significant incidents or excesses. During the entire operation, there were a total of 4 cases of individual armed resistance from those being evicted. During attempts to resist and escape, 7 people being evicted were killed and 4 were wounded. During the roundup, 12 families and 5 individuals escaped, and while being escorted to the loading station, 3 people escaped, but 12 people were detained." As a result of Operation South in the Moldavian SSR, up to 11,293 families were deported, which amounts to about 35,000 people. Tens of thousands of people were driven like cattle to faraway places, including the elderly, women, and children, whose guilt was neither investigated nor proven by a court. They were taken to the railway stations, mostly by truck. Then the deportees were transferred into freight cars, to Kazakhstan and Siberia. In just a few days, 30 trains with 1,573 cars were sent out, and the journey to the special settlements took from 2 to 4 weeks. And unfortunately, there were no nurses or doctors with the deportees, so many died before reaching their place of exile. As Anna Vlas, born in 1938, recalled, "We traveled day and night, and during long stops they gave us food. They used to say, 2 people, 1 sack and 2 buckets. That's how they brought us food. One would carry a sack of bread, the other buckets of porridge or soup. When the train stopped, we were allowed to get out of the carriage, and they told us to relieve ourselves, which meant to go to the bathroom. So everyone went together, young and old, men and women. Then we arrived in Krasnoyarsk, where we were all taken off the train and separated so they could take us to the bathhouse, because we were infested with lice. 3 weeks without washing and sleeping in your clothes like a pig. We washed up, our clothes were disinfected, and then we were loaded back into the train car. That's how we traveled another day from Krasnoyarsk to Parchin Station in the Chunsky district of Irkutsk region. When we arrived, we were under guard. We were unloaded on the riverbank. Everyone was with children, with a pile of belongings, and then a soldier came and said, 'From now on, you live here. No one will ever return to Moldova, and you will rot here forever.'" The results of the deportation exceeded all the authorities' expectations. From July to November 1949, the percentage of peasant households joining collective farms increased from 32 to 80%, and by January 1950, the share of collective farmers was 97%. Fearing new waves of deportations, the peasants gave up their land and other property in favor of the state. The forced deportation carried out by armed NKVD units shocked Moldova, flooding it with tears of grief. The deportation of tens of thousands of people not only undermined trust in Soviet power, but also caused enormous damage to the image of the Soviet people in the eyes of Moldovans. Even now, not a single history textbook in Russian schools mentions the atrocities committed against other peoples. Russians still believe in their own invincibility and their ability to behave however they want toward other nations and peoples, and this is their big mistake. Inhumanity takes root only when you don't admit your mistakes. Well, the rehabilitation of deported Moldovans only began after Stalin's death. Unfortunately, not everyone was able to return to their homeland, and many remained living in exile. Such is the history of the Soviet Union. Such is the history of all the crimes committed under the USSR and now being committed by Russia. Suggest topics in the comments and share your opinion about the deportations and what's happening now in general. It's very important to us. And don't forget to share the video with your friends. By the way, if you want to support the channel financially, you can do so by making a direct transfer to PayPal or by subscribing on Patreon. Your support really helps me during this difficult time. See you in the next episode. See you soon. Bye.
Пока.